Okay, so migration policy, and I'm just going to go back over a few things that relate to policy. You might not see them as such, but clearly it is a policy decision of government, and then it influences other things. And I recommend reading Stephen Castle's. There's various versions of that book, but the chapter what I do have on my uni is just the factors that make and unmake migration policy. So it's a chapter about policy. The only thing I'm really going to delve into is open border policy and how that actually relates to particularly European context of how they perceive some migration. And I'd argue that's actually why they're in such a big problem right at the moment with a lot of refugees. So I can start off with exploding some myths about population. Because clearly migration is basic to understanding population growth and also change in structure, composition. Basically, population is dynamic, and guess what? Migration is one of the most volatile parts or processes in that population growth. It's always changing. In some respects, the change can be quite gradual, and it often escapes the attention of policymakers. I just think I'll close this door. It's influenced by economic changes, but it's not purely a function of them. People sort of always try to link population migration to economic dynamics, but clearly it's not always associated with those dynamics at all. And it's not a function necessarily of economics, whilst we spend a lot of time talking about movement from low to high income countries, etc. There's other often aspects. Some population change is structural, it's happening, it's built into the age structure, it's predictable, and in terms of looking at the future, we can look with some certainty about ageing populations, for example. Age structures very swollen in the middle, they're going to, given continuation trends in mortality or improvements in mortality, you'll see those structures get even more aged. Same with migration, relatively young. Those younger groups come in at a point in time, if they stay within that population structure, we can predict with some certainty just how they're going to move up those population structures. Population overall is amenable to policy intervention, and in this course we've been looking at migration control in Australia, and I'm calling it control because while policies basically determine how many and who come into the country, they come under that domain of highly planned migration and highly controlled migration. And do you remember when we went through change of names in the department, for example, responsible for migration, and it's gone under various guises, citizenship, the most recent, and then more since 2013 anyway, it's been border protection. So remember we had that lecture on security, migration and security. It's really much greater emphasis now on the national interest and security concerns and control of one borders. Intervention as policy in terms of fertility, pro-natalist, child payments or bonuses, anti-natalist, really it was family planning, reproductive health, trying to control population and fertility of women, but make sure you've got a healthy population of women and children. There can be population distribution policy, and I'll get to that in a minute, talking about Australia's more recent regional policy, which has caused distributional effects to the immigration than were not there before the 2000. international migration as an instrument of development, both emigration and immigration. So this linking of migration now to development, in particular in a lot of low middle income countries, has become very important to them. Immigration to Australia is important to Australia in terms of its economic growth, ameliorating ageing and improving its productivity. Okay, so concerns about the workforce as that ages and the burden that's going to put on is fairly predictable. It's there, it's a given, unless everybody's going to leave Australia suddenly or we're going to have high rates of death. That's one of the policy concerns. Not just Australia I'm looking at here, but during the last quarter century, a portion of governments have viewed immigration as too high, increased from about 7 to 25%. More than 1/3 of countries report policies designed to change migration from its current level, so that can be up or down. And from 1996 to 2011, countries wanting to increase immigration rose from 4 to 11, while those wanting to lower migration fell from around 40 to 16, and those indicating no intervention had risen from 55 to 73. So most countries are comfortable, if you like, with migration as it is, and are going to keep it as much as the same. Some are wanting to lower it and some of them wanting to increase it. Some of that's come from a shift in European countries, always been seen as high immigration countries, to them competing for immigrants to stop, in some cases, population decline, and again for the same reasons, very ageing populations wanting to stimulate productivity and growth within those countries. These are just policies to influence the level of immigration. This is to raise immigration, probably the lowest level here, but to maintain with no necessary intervention, that's the one that's actually increased. And the ones wanting to lower it has also obviously increased. So some countries feel immigration has reached its limit, and obviously we need to not encourage immigration but have policies that maybe hamper immigration, and that is a difficult one, because if people really want to go to certain countries, they'll try all sorts of means to actually try to activate the system. Changes in the migration discourse that we have been going through quite methodically over the last few weeks, and some of the exercises, if you might have noticed. Clearly one of the themes, if you like, we were talking about was the migration and development nexus. So particularly win for origin countries as well as sending countries, and win for migrants. The 3 wins, win-win-win circumstances, and we've been looking at how that relates to development all around, not just specifically for countries of destination. We also looked at the emergence of transnationalism as a dominant paradigm. And most of you, I think, should know by now what transnationalism and what was it replacing? A more traditional approach which what was a traditional approach? More predominant, like settlement. People move from one place to another, and that was the end of the story. It was natural migration, and that, in that context, very many gains for the, obviously, the country of destination rather than where they've actually come from. Transnationalism is indicating greater non-permanent movement and flexibility, circulation, which also means government policies have changed to allow that to happen. And Australia's migration policies change, and I keep talking about a watershed, a benchmark. When was that? Sorry?
1996.
Yeah, 1995, or mid-90s, a change of paradigm. We really did change. And we could only change, that paradigm could only change from more permanent to temporary migration, whereby now it exceeds its permanent migration, because government policies changed. So legislation allowed that and allowed different sorts of visas to come into play. So policy played an important part in that actually happening. It didn't just happen because we had a related to it was more globalisation and movement of a labour market in the world, requiring skilled labour. And if we wanted to remain competitive, we basically had to change. But it wasn't until the government policy was implemented and it was by law, regulation changed, that we could have different sorts of visas and different sorts of ways we accommodated temporary migrants. It couldn't happen until that happened. So the government policy there was really important, and it's implementing that policy with different visa types was important. So if I ask a question in the exam about what happened after 1995 or what's the paradigm shift, that's actually what I'm talking about. Increased pressure of global and regional governance of migration. Again, increasing nations having to come to grips with this extra circulation and extra pressure put on them because of higher mobility. And clearly regional governance or governance was important in controlling some of that and managing that as well. And also increased interest of governments in remittances and diasporas amenable to policy intervention. Okay, so we went through basically in themes, things like diasporas, remittances, and the increasing interest of government, because in many low-income countries, middle-income countries, remittances are meaning much more than foreign direct investments or overseas aid, so they become an important component, if you like, of the whole migration development nexus. What's different is the governments have now recognised the importance, and clearly that's become part of their institutional approach to also looking at how best they can actually gain out of diasporas as well as their remittance flows. So, okay, beyond the 3 Ds, driving migration, and remember development, demography and democracy were 3 big drivers, particularly of Asian mobility. But there's other things that go with that. So on top of that, and things that have encouraged that, is the immigration industry itself. It's a big industry, the middleman, promoting and consulting with governments, but also with employers and big companies, etc., has been crucial or essential to actually the flows of people that have been occurring, particularly for work, overseas contract work. Remember I said even part of that industry is marriage migration, trying to set up marriage partners or recruiting brides in Vietnam or Philippines to go to Korea and Japan. Labour market segmentation. What do I mean by that? What's been important in my female migration context?
Going overseas to work?
Sorry?
Is it going overseas? To work and
So a sex-segregated labour market is important. Some labour markets are really looking for female workers. Female workers as domestics, care workers, entertainers, and also in factory work, electronics. They're meant to be much better with their finger. They're more dexterous, they're more complacent generally, evidently. And in other words, garments, manufacture shoes, electronics, they're much better at those sort of jobs than the males. So that labour market segmentation, meaning some jobs specifically for males, some for females, and mainly low-skilled, semi-skilled jobs in those two markets have been driving a lot of migration between Asian countries themselves, as well as the Middle East and other countries looking for basically cheap costing of manufacturing those sort of goods. But the richer Asian countries, Middle East, wherever, they want care workers, they want domestics, jobs that a lot of the locals won't actually do. Just maids, big hotels need domestic workers, etc. Massive those changes in technology and communication, transport in particular, can actually allow relatively cheap transportation to jobs elsewhere. And also communications, remember, transnational mothering, etc., become much easier at a distance to keep in contact with families. Increased levels of education generally, that's not just saying everybody's tertiary educated now, just means people have completed primary, and even some years of secondary schooling gives them advantages in going into some of these markets as migrants. They might not be your highly skilled, highly educated, but they are much better off than those with very little education, so they have these opportunities to actually move much more. And who are more likely to be more educated across all those countries? Young people now. So the young adults now moving into the working age populations are much more educated, and educated can just mean completed primary or started secondary school, more so than a generation or so before them. Globalisation of private industries. So industries locate globally where they can get cheap labour or whatever, and they also import labour to where they can set up factories, or government incentives for them to set up factories. And also increased government involvement. The Indian, Philippines, etc. have set up ministries of emigration, so trying to control people leaving and making sure to ensure their rights and to ensure memorandums of understanding are also set up with governments where those workers are actually going. Okay, now I just want to look at open border policy. I'm not going to dwell on it, but I just really want you to look at what does it mean. So basically it advocates, anyway, the removal of any form of migration control. Okay, so that is what open border policy basically is advocating. However, Castles actually argues there's two contradictory schools of thought, proponents of this. One is the neoclassical economists. The other is left-wing critics of government migration policies, particularly refugees, abuse of human rights. They say that wouldn't happen if we had open border policies. I don't know, I don't quite understand where they're coming from sometimes, and I think it's more applicable to the European context than we see in the Asia Pacific domain where we locate it. So maybe open border policy works better in Europe and places where you have similar level economies, where you have very different income economies. I have problems trying to perceive how it's going to work. So my neoclassical proponents, they claim if you leave regulation to market forces will optimise the benefits of migration for both sending and receiving countries and help in the long run to equalise wages between them, leading to a new global equilibrium. Fantastic, it sounds great, but I'm not sure how that works with very disparate economies and circumstances and governments. But anyway, that's the argument, that over time it would equalise very much wages. And so migration, very much for obtaining higher wages of relative educated people, that equilibrium will even out, and clearly. In a way, they're still talking about skilled movements, skilled migration workers. So it's quite confined, really. And you could also argue open border policy for skilled workers probably is relatively working throughout the world if you have the skills to match the countries where you're wanting to go. Left-wing critics, however, many of the left think that freedom of movement will eliminate discriminatory and repressive state measures, especially detention and deportation, and enhance migrants' human rights. They also argue that the economies of both sending and receiving countries will benefit, and that migration will not rise to insupportable levels because most people, guess what, will prefer to stay home. Okay, so I don't know how idealistic that is. So if Australia opened its migration policies, if everybody in Asia or Africa would just stay home and not perceive better opportunities elsewhere, and I guess it does come down to how you can afford it and what are the linkages, etc. Anyway, but anyway, interesting ideas, and that is the basis for a lot of open border policy. I went to a conference once and there was all these, it was a Metropolis conference, it's a big international one, and all these people were bobbing up arguing, you know, for one way or the other, or dead against it. But the ones for it, if you could really, were sort of neighbouring countries that are very like Europe, in very similar circumstances, and you could understand what they were arguing. But for other people, we're just saying, well, we don't know how that would work. We just open the border, let anybody in. And this guy was saying, it will sort out. It will sort. Once they all get there, it will sort. And I was thinking, maybe it's better not to actually get to that situation where you're saying it will sort out somehow. Well, I don't know. Maybe I've been brought up in Australia, so I don't see the benefits of just saying, oh, anybody can come and we'll look after them once they get here. I can't see it happening. So the problems with open border policy, maybe not less regulation, maybe more, not less regulation of highly skilled. They'd probably be still a group that actually maybe they would have different outcomes within this open border policy. Employers often favour uncontrolled migration, as can lead to lower wages for competing local labour. So it generally will lower the wage structure. And that's what neoclassical is saying, that it's assuming that all wages will be equal and going up rather than lowering of wages, and actually which could cause depression of wages in some countries. Clashes between immigrants and local workers because of pressure on wages and who's getting jobs, and makes cause more racism and violence. And this was the reaction of people at this conference, that clearly it won't just sort, what's it sought after, conflicts and resolutions. Surely it's better them not happening than trying to sort it afterwards. And will eliminate distinction between refugees and economic migrants. If no control of entry, or no one's actually looking at who's who. Situations of widespread conflicts may actually go against refugees, and abuse refugees convention, which often is the only way it means that they get protection and get special resettlement. So maybe they could be worse off, not generally better off. And could lead to many new problems where the weakest tend to be the most disadvantaged, even more so. Clearly, because they don't have the means, they can't have, they don't get access to jobs, or they don't actually, so it perpetuates maybe a situation where they may have been better in their home countries. Okay, constraints on developing a migration and development policy in Australia. The first one is, in Australia's policy, it's always in the national interest. So migration policy, everything else, visa categories are framed in the national interest. Security is framed in the national interest. So if you read the website, Department of Immigration's website, a lot of things are just in the national interest, socially, economically and politically is what the wording will be. And that has been a preoccupation from the beginning. They can reason the need for skilled migration into Australia, and they don't drop that. They don't drop that very much as terms of really supporting a lot of unskilled, particularly contract workers. We've never really had a lot of low-skilled contract workers in Australia. We moved from a policy generally of family migration, settlement, to one of temporary migration, but we didn't, and we also moved to more highly skilled migration, but we sort of didn't drop to saying, okay, anybody without certain skills can come in. Separate government agencies that deal with immigration, employment, social security, big separation of some of those functions. Also unskilled and semi-skilled labour demands generally not being met under current temporary business visas, etc., or under the permanent settlement visa schemes. For example, overseas contractors, unskilled, semi-skilled, there's a few programs around for people from Tonga. My PhD student's working on that at the moment, but it's got all sort of limitations and it's not really set up for family migration, but it's very small. Generally, we haven't encouraged that sort of migration. In respect to the mining industries and remote areas, there was a push for a while then to bring in more unskilled, semi-skilled, because that's what was needed in some of those industries. It hasn't really got a big response. It says we need to recruit local workers. We don't need to recruit overseas people without jobs or semi-skilled. So there's a lot of competition arguments, and some of that comes from the unions movement in Australia, labour union movement, which has been strong, and really its role is to protect wages and protect conditions of its workers. And for that reason, generally, low-cost workers don't come under some of those agreements. Whilst employers might like them, there's been a reluctance to actually let that go in on certain sorts of visas. Discrimination at the individual level, generally. What does the points test discriminate people on? Points, independent points of test, what does it need? English language, age, qualifications. If you've got an Australian university qualification, you'll get even more points. Experience in Australia, so you get lots of points. So it's discrimination in terms, if you can't meet those pass marks, you basically can't get a permanent visa. So the overemphasis on skill in policy has become more dominant in the last decade, and it's been roughly about 2/3 of permanent settlement migrants. And that's not to say that temporary migration's even more so, because you have to have employers and meeting certain skill criteria set down for them as well. So there's a mismatch between immigration policy and labour demand in some sectors. There's some ways they do get around it. For example, cooks. You need a Thai cook or an Indian cook for Indian food, or Afghan food or Nepalese food. You wanted to import a cook. And for a long time, you could be an employer and nominate someone from Nepal who didn't have the requisite English sort of requirements. But they've tightened a lot of that up as well. It's the only way you're really getting... But then you could argue that's still a skill. It's a semi-skilled occupation. So, yeah, there's all sorts of reasons some people can get around some of that. And particularly if you're a regional area and you really need some sort of workers, like meat workers. Murray Bridge recruit a lot of meat workers, 457s. They were saying, excuse me, where they weren't meeting a lot of other requirements, but because that was an occupation needed at the time, they could get in. Seasonal agricultural labour, also often met by working holiday makers. So the scheme I was just talking about for Tongans and Pacific Islanders, they don't actually get their full quota of work they could get in Australia. It's done by a lot of working holiday makers, which the employers actually prefer, evidently, because they come and they go and they can pick up jobs along the way, and that's where all your seasonal working holiday makers you'll see around the rivers and around wherever there's horticulture, agriculture production. I'll just go back to this. These are your components of growth. Remember, this blue line, the dark blue line going through here is total population growth. We can see the extent to population growth is dictated by this pale blue line, which is your net overseas migrants. Your red line going through here is natural increase, your births over your deaths. So in other words, your population growth rates can fluctuate primarily through these migrants. Even the fact your natural increase can go up a bit here, it's because of the fertility associated with a lot of these migrants. Remember, they're young adults, so they're family-bearing sort of ages, so you do get an upturn a bit in fertility as well. But the real difference, or the real hikes, are wherever you get high net overseas migration. And clearly the troughs occur when that drops off. So a very close relationship. These are the components of net overseas migration. Again, the red is the visitors, which is pretty constant all the way through here. These are projected trends. Your dark blue coming through here is other temporary classes other than 457s, which are meant to actually decline below that age line. Subclass 457s is the green, where it's got really quite large relatively recently. That's expected to drop off and increase. Yellow, orange, whatever, is your working holiday makers, which again is meant to be an upturn. Your pale blue sitting up the top are your permanent migration. These are students, also expected to be quite high. So there's various components, and they do change with any changes in rules by government, also changes in demand. So temporary workers recruited because of employers nominating them and wanting them are likely to decline. If the economy goes off the boil, we'll see, I think, a drop in some of those temporary workers. Working holiday makers and others are likely to stay up there, and students, but some other temporaries will decline. This is settler arrivals from Asia, and just from Asia. And as you can see, that's sort of basically increased in recent years to 50% of all the total intake. And these are permanents, these are settler arrivals. So that's been a big market for us, or a big area whereby we've picked up amongst the settler arrivals. That will then come through into some of the stock of data. I'll just back to that data set. That is arrival of settler arrivals from arrival cards into Australia. Flow data is how we measure that. So those permanent settlers in a particular year, if they're permanent settlers, we do have a bit more than just arrival cards, but clearly they've been given permanent visas. And if we're looking at the stock of migrants, we use census material. I'm just doing a bit of revision here to make it clear that how we get our flow data and how we actually get our stock data. 2011 is our most recent data source. We've had a new census, but it might take a long time for us to get that data. Anyway, the numbers, in numbers, it's still United Kingdom, Channel Islands, Isle of Man are the biggest group, over 1 million. New Zealand, funnily enough, is the next biggest. As we said, remember, non-visaed migration and connections, and clearly have to be New Zealand citizens, but we can actually trade places. China, next. India, not surprising, biggest populations, biggest lots of migrants. Italy is still up there, and that's a lot of stock from the post-war period, in particular in Australia. Vietnam is high. That was a period, particularly late 70s, 80s. Philippines, relatively high. South Africa, been a lot of South African migration, right through 2000s, for example. Malaysia and Germany. Germany also has a bit of a hangover from some of the post-war. So that's your stock of migrants. Okay, that's overseas born in Australia in 2011. If we look at the fastest growing groups, 2006-11, again, this is still your stock, and we rely on census, which is old now, but that's the most recent. And again, the biggest growing group has been Nepal. Again, a lot of problems in Nepal, and that's generated quite a bit of growth, attractiveness to Australia. Saudi Arabia, India, Colombia, Brazil, Pakistan, Burma, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, etc. So the growth rate sometimes is based on a relatively small number, so it looks quite exaggerated, but clearly they're the groups that have shown the biggest numeric increases between those two censuses. I dare say that probably the next census, when we get the material, will even show a different shift in some of those countries. So examining the distribution of migrants within a country has not often been done. Most immigration or international research looks at it across national borders. However, where they settle within countries has been important, and increasingly Australia has refocused too on where to settle migrants, or where best to accommodate them. So generally migrants settle differently to the resident populations, and that might be because of labour force contemporary situation. Particularly if we're demanding skilled workers, are more likely to be jobs in the capital cities. Chain migration means where previous groups of your ethnic or your country groups have settled, you'll follow to those cities or where the connections have been made. Information factors, maybe recruiting. South Australian government does a fair bit on what a lovely place Adelaide is, you know, how much of that creates a flow into Adelaide or other regions, and generally government policy. It doesn't usually influence where migration settles within countries, but Australia, remember, has a regional specific scheme in place. Okay, so that sort of came into being along with a lot of the temporary migration, mid-90s to late 90s, 2000. And just to remind you of what the state-specific regional schemes are, they also were a new set of policy regulations. So they didn't just happen, they happened through policy implemented by government, change of regulations, change of rules. So immigrants for the first time were directed to where they settled, and they get bonus points in our independent point assessment scheme to settle in a regional area. They also, employers will get a quicker ride into Australia if it's regional employers in some areas demanding labour. That's temporary migrants as well. That can be state governments as well as just sponsorship. And that can even be local governments wanting, could be police force, could be nurses wanted in Ceduna Hospital or somewhere. So, yeah.
The Tongan or Pacific, would they go under government sponsored?
The Tongan, that's a special.
Or is it just?
That's a special scheme. That's separate because it is a semi-unskilled migrant contract scheme, so it doesn't actually come under this. And it's not permanent, and it's not even temporary, because they're actually on contracts usually for a period of time and then they go home. Provision for students under that scheme gaining extra points for permanent residents to go and work in or study in a regional centre. No skilled independent regional visas allow temporary residents for 2 years or work full time for at least 1 year to qualify for permanent residence. And this is where we're different. In some countries, if you come in on a temporary work visa, you can actually or a student visa, you can actually upgrade in the country, onshore it's called, to that more permanent visa. Settling of refugee humanitarian groups in regional locations, which has caused some problems for their integration, and that regional 457 program trying to get workers to regional centres whereby locals won't go. So the role of that temporary migration has been important, and it's increasingly been significant in filling gaps in the labour force. Both 457s and working holiday workers, as I said, have become really important for seasonal fruit picking, grape picking, other seasonal employment jobs, some in areas they can't source local labour. Often there's little knowledge of the numbers and location. It's hazy. We don't often have good numbers, particularly on a lot of those temporary holiday makers and other workers. And they've been generally successful, but there's been also criticisms because of low wage and abuse, and don't have generally some of the work regulations. Okay, the localities of working holiday makers where they visited, they really do cling very much to the coast and northern Australia, and clearly there's a lot of seasonal jobs in tourism, bars, fruit picking, etc. The major cities, this is River Murray, so you get fruit picking very much through there. Perth, Darwin, you get mango picking, other picking certain times of the year. So they very much hug the coast and very much, what do you call it? Tropical sort of climate, pleasant climate. They'll get work sporadically. Some of these are mining settlements too, that clearly there's work usually for working holiday makers. So just key issues. So immigrant settlements driven by structural changes in the economy, if it's mining or if it's fruit picking or something that's needing local or local labour demand is not meeting the need. Role of policy. Policy actually makes quite a big impact within this. Most recently, I think there's a back down again, but they wanted to tax your working holiday makers differently. I'm not quite sure what they're going to do, but they didn't like it, so they backed down a bit now, and they're not going to be taxed at quite the same rates as they were going to be. Skilled and unskilled dimensions going on here. Your working holiday makers are often filling, and those contract jobs, filling niches in the market that aren't being supplied by the migration program per se, because of its emphasis on skill. New issues in settlement adjustment, putting refugees in country settlements that are very not used to cultural diversity is not necessarily a good thing, and they've often been ostracised and they're not really welcomed very much, and they'll quickly move out back to cities where they've got a lot of their own kin. So that extent of retention is important. These schemes are trying to distribute migrants differently, but if they really want to live in the capital cities, that's where they'll ultimately try to go, because we don't have a really strict mechanism to register somewhere and stay there. They move. And increasing interdependence between internal and international migration. We've only really been starting to look at it in recent years. It's very much in two separate camps, but it's come much closer now. We have to understand what's happening. And clearly, regional development discourse often is not really interested in looking at the role of immigrants in a lot of their country towns, etc. So, lack of understanding of some aspects. First of all, what we don't really understand sometimes, so what are the patterns of migration into and out of regions? We get the census data every 5 years, and longer than that time it gets to be analysed. That's our main data source generally, and so sometimes we really miss what's going on till much later when we've seen patterns or stock of migrants in certain areas. Oh, how did that happen? Where did that come from, basically? The characteristics of migrants, and maybe we should be looking at how they differ from migrants settling in capital cities, because we're sort of creating a two-tier system, some people argue, and therefore our regional migrants getting our bonus points, etc., are a different class than those that get full bonus points and get straight to city locations, etc. Not much work done on that, but clearly people are starting to say, well, maybe there's really different characteristics, but there's not much regulation of stopping that movement anyway, so perhaps we should just understand it. What are the drivers for some of the migration? What are the levels of retention? Importantly, what is the response of the local communities to having groups of migrants? Again, depends who they are. And key policy dimensions, obviously, migration's role in regional development, adjustment process and retention. So if there's a policy there trying to put migrants into other centres, encouragement, incentives, we need to know more about some of the impacts and what's actually occurring, and we don't, basically. The spatial dimensions of settlement. Before World War II were quite dispersed, although concentrated always in large cities. After the post-war period, up to 2000, most migrants were going into Sydney and Melbourne, and that's where some of the regional policies were coming from. The pressure, Carr as Premier of New South Wales at the time was saying we're not taking any more immigrants, and he was most in favour of pushing them elsewhere. South Australian government, early 2000s, was saying we want them, so that's where a big push for regional dispersion of migrants coming into Australia. And obviously variation between groups and shifts most recently through that policy. Just all you need to take from this is that clearly that 1947 period is about over a third in rest of state from major capital cities. We're down to roughly about 20% or a fifth. It fluctuates a bit, but a fifth of the overseas born population is made up of overseas born people. The demographic implication: migration has an increasing role in population growth, as I showed you, in its composition in terms of age structure, and more so, most recently, in its distribution. Increasing influence on natural increase due to the selectivity of young family formation groups and on fertility. Major element in skill education growth related to productivity and also social influence and greater diversity. Policy issues in Australia, the scale, the caps on those visa types for permanent settlement. Is there room for manoeuvre there? What can we do about it? Those management of visa types, point assessments and rules, they're quite strict and they change over time as well. Balance between temporary and permanent migration. That balance, getting more and more temporary compared to permanent. Where migrants are settling is increasingly important in terms of the push to get them to regions to promote regional growth. Migration development issues, refugee, asylum and settler numbers, settlement issues, ageing and workforce, etc. And the last one there, public and media response to migrants and refugees, is also how it flavours the attitudes of the public to migration. Inclusion in the Australian context. Policy changes have given new significance to international migration in regional as opposed to just only national development, and that's been that change particularly since 2000. Governance crucial in maximising benefits of highly planned migration program, and let's face it, we have a highly planned migration program. We need to harness current security focus to enhance migration and management, and clearly, as I explained a few weeks ago in a lecture, a couple of weeks ago, much more stricter controls and surveillance of people coming into the country. Need to come up with a system of rights which protect the migrants but also recognise they are not full citizens, and we need fairness in some of those contexts, particularly New Zealanders in Australia that aren't actually citizens and can't get citizenship because they clearly have come in on different ways, and need for public debate. Global context, migration can be both negative and positive depending the type of migration and context. We need to provide appropriate, secure and well-managed channels for migration, because trafficking is a major industry, and trafficking is really problematic on your open border policy notions too. Need for a mix of permanent and non-permanent migration, for more circulation and return migration. Migration is no substitute for fundamental development. We need good economic policy and they need good governance. And cooperation of sending and receiving countries is crucial to maximising benefit, particularly the receiving end. So Australia, I think, could have much more involvement in more family-friendly policy sometimes in respect to home countries and where they're getting migrants. Okay, so that's the last lecture. I'm sorry I tried to go through in a bit of a revision how policy does relate to most things we've actually been doing. We might not have spelt it out properly, but clearly it's there. And on Thursday, I